All right, for the tech powwow this week, let's look at should we use the latest version? And this is a good question, especially when it comes to software in general. Imagine that we're talking about something like MongoDB or SQL Server, where we have a choice to use the latest version or not. Now, first of all, there's no excuse to have at least one development environment, even with the buggy versions. And the buggy versions I'm referring to more to the MongoDB. This is not the most stable release. Those are expected to have bugs. Obviously, you're not going to go release that into production, but there's no excuse to have a development environment, to not have a development environment. I mean, that is not set up with one of those unstable versions and test things, because when changes occur, in the long run, that may be the direction that happens. Okay, so any organization, any large organization, I should say, should definitely have at least one development environment with the latest version. In the case of SQL Server, it's 2016, and MongoDB, I believe, is 3.2 last time I looked. Okay, now there are some exceptions for production. The most obvious being a vocal community against the latest version. You generally want to use the latest version of software for new applications and infrastructure. Existing is you put an asterisk by. Okay, provided that a window of testing time for the community has been available. It is true that if it has just been released, you will definitely want to do a lot of work in development first and really test it out. And I mean, break it to pieces, see all of the different things that could go wrong. Okay. Consider the community critiques for the architecture of your application, especially for existing applications. What are the downsides? A great example of this is when 2014 first came out, people were really excited about the in-memory tables. And in fact, you can read all kinds of great information online about in-memory tables. But there are some limitations to in-memory tables. And I was at, one of the local users group here not too long ago, and one of the guys who worked at a large organization, a lot of servers, he was pointing out, he's like, we just couldn't use it anywhere. And the reason is because all of the restrictions of the in-memory tables prevented us from using it. And he's like, so you see these demos and they're like, whoa, that's so cool. But when you actually get in and start testing it and you test it with your application, you realize, oh, but we can't use it for that. No, we can't use it for that. And that's why you definitely want to be looking at, first of all, having a test environment for that, but you want to be considering the community critiques, because anytime someone presents something as, look at all these benefits, if it doesn't come with any critiques, then they're probably misleading you. Unintentionally, of course, but they're definitely misleading you. Because if it's not something you can apply to your application, yeah, then there's no reason to get the latest version, unless, of course, support is on the line. Now, there are major pros to using the latest version, especially in production. If there's no issues and if there's no community critique of the latest version. The first one is that it's the technical version of saving 20% of your income. I've seen a lot of organizations, a lot of clients in general, that go into technical debt, and it's unintended, but they go into technical debt because they're using an older version of the software, like an older version of MongoDB or an older version of SQL Server that fixes some of the issues they're experiencing. Okay, what ends up happening is you eventually fall into a deficit in terms of time. And so the result is, like with a big organization, your DBA team or your BI team have to constantly work extra hours. And then, of course, that leads to high turnover, right? Because people don't want to do that. Why? Well, because some of these issues that you're experiencing were fixed in later versions or would give you tools to fix them much easier, but you're not in the latest version. The other one is it introduces change and additional learning to your IT team. This is a big mistake in bigger organizations specifically. Smaller organizations have this one mastered. Big organizations, they get into a habit of doing things very slowly on the learning and change side. And the result is that the IT people stagnate. And you see this because you talk to people in IT and you're like, you've never used this or you've never done that, or you'll know this because they'll always say the same thing. I really need to learn this. Well, why aren't you learning it right now? They're behind, right? They're playing catch up because of how slow everything occurs. So change and additional learning, introducing that to your IT team by pushing the latest version, that pushes that on that team. And so they're going to have to make it happen. People respond to expectations. As Joe Polish says, it's not that people, It's not that people work well under pressure. It's that when people are under pressure, they actually work. And also the other thing too is if people are in tech and they don't like change, then they shouldn't be in tech. Go become a librarian. That'll never change, or it'll rarely change. But if you don't like change, there are all kinds of jobs for you. Tech is not one of them. In some cases, there is longer support for the latest version. If there is not, you might want to consider not using the latest version. But in the case of SQL Server, for instance, if you were to pick 2012 over 2014 or 2016, you just cut off a length of support. Once that becomes the older version and they no longer support that, well, you actually just charged yourself if you have a massive issue, right? And then finally, generally newer software resolves older issues. There are exceptions to that rule, but that's usually the case. Again, there will be a vocal community if it does not, okay? And then finally, of course, you should develop in general just a rollback plan. And you should have this in case of migrations. We've all experienced those migrations that didn't go well. And before doing that, we always have a rollback plan to say, okay, if this doesn't go well, then we're going to roll it back to this version. And that way everything occurs smoothly. So you want to have that in place before, of course, you do the move. But in general, a rollback plan is something that's an absolute must-have. So yes, my thumbs up is to using the latest version specifically, at least in a dev environment with thorough testing. If there are a lot of vocal people in the community that are against it, avoid it. And then, of course, finally, if your architecture of your application is so specific to the version, then you should be very careful about using a later version. And those situations, only a person knows their own environment and whether that's true.